Mm-hmm.
I caught myself singing that song several times this week.
Yay. Good. It helps to speak those words.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like prayer, when you speak those words or when you sing, it gets your heart in a line with God. So it hurts. There's pain in the offering, but yes. All right, so today we are on lesson 4. The title of this lesson is The Three Amigos. So we have looked at the prologue where it's hard to believe we're studying Job with this kind of laughter, right? We have looked at the prologue, the interaction between Satan and God, Satan's accusations against Job and God himself, and how God upholds Job's uprightness and permits Satan to afflict him. We have looked at how Job was afflicted and all that he suffered, and he, with his mouth, did not sin against God, and he said, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." So today we're going to examine what his 3 friends have to say. After all of Job's suffering, he now has to undergo their scrutiny, their exacting scrutiny. So we're going to try and understand the middle of the book in one lesson, right? We spent a lot of time at the beginning of the book. We're going to spend a lot of time at the end of the book. The bulk of the book, the dialogue between Job and his 3 friends, is very poetic. They'll make a point and they will elaborate on that point in a very poetic and beautiful way. So it's a quite long dialogue. So what I've attempted to do in this lesson is to summarize the positions of these 3 friends. Now, Job has more than 3 friends. He actually has 4. Elihu comes in on the end of it, but we're just going to be looking at the 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar today. And we'll talk about Elihu in another lesson. So Job has been afflicted. He has suffered all of these tragedies, and he is left stunned. And of course, his friends hear about it, and they come to visit him. So that's where we're going to start our lesson today. So turn to chapter 2, and would someone please read verses 11 and 12. Job chapter 2, verses 11, well, let's go 11 through 13.
When Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was.
All right, so they heard about his suffering. They came from their regions to visit him. Now, I think they had probably visited him before. They were friends, so they had been at his estate. They had seen his animals, his home, his children's home, the greatness of his family, the reputation that he had. So that's what they're used to. So they come to visit Job, and they are absolutely speechless. How do you suppose? For 7 days. And that's probably the most comforting part of their ministry to Job, is their silence, right? They tear their robes, they put dust on their head, they weep, and they sit in silence with him just to show their empathy, to share in his sufferings for this week. What do you suppose Job looked like to them?
Older, I would say.
A shadow.
A shadow?
Yeah,
Thin? Old? Like a zombie? Remember whenever he was responding to his suffering, what he did? He shaved his head. So he's shaved his head. What's he covered in by this point? Ashes and boils, right? So they are absolutely astounded at the difference between his prosperity and now his affliction.
He probably looks like the beggar on the street.
Exactly.
If not a little worse.
Mm-hmm. Instead of the glow of a rich and reputable person, a healthy person, he has the shadow of death upon him. He's also incredibly depressed. In fact, all of chapter 3, he's basically saying, I wish that I had never been born. He's suffering so much that he very poetically says, I wish the day had never dawned. I wish that I had never been conceived. I wish that when I was born, I had died at birth. So he is incredibly depressed. He's down. He's humble. He looks sick. Any sort of attractiveness that he may have had is now gone, and his friends are absolutely astounded because they've seen him in his prosperity. Now they're seeing him at the lowest of lows. So they sit in silence for a week. Can you imagine that?
No.
In one way, they're expressing their empathy for him. They're experiencing the suffering with him, and on the other hand, they're completely speechless. They don't know what to say. They're probably starting to form their opinions and think and try and understand what it is that he's suffering. So Job is completely humbled, right? Looking at Job, what he's suffering, and remembering what God said about him, that he is upright and he shuns evil. Remember, that came from the mouth of God. Job is upright and he shuns evil. And now looking at him covered in these boils and sitting in ashes, he looks like a type of Christ. And by the way, we're going to spend a whole lesson where we study Job as a type of Christ or a foreshadow, a prefigure of Christ. But let's just look at a glimpse of it here. In Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 15, the chapter before Isaiah 53, which alludes to Christ, it says, "See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance," this is about Jesus, right? "His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand." So again, this is about the Messiah. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. This is talking about the beatings of Christ. He was beaten, he was tortured, he was hung on a cross. There is another scripture in Isaiah that talks about they plucked the beard out of his face. So they beat him so badly that he was marred beyond human likeness. So if you were to look upon Christ in his suffering, you wouldn't recognize him, and you would be astounded at what he had suffered. This is how Job looks, right? He doesn't have his hair, his prosperity is gone, he's suffering, he's depressed, he's crying out to God, he's completely covered in boils. When we look at Jesus on the cross, 2 Corinthians 5:21 says about Jesus, "For he hath made him to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him." So when Jesus was on the cross, he was made to be sin, and his appearance was not attractive on the cross. Jesus had no sin, yet he became sin, and he suffered insults while he was on the cross. This is Job. Job was upright and he shunned evil. Keep in mind, he was a sinner. He was not perfect and he could not be justified by his own righteousness before God. But God himself said about Job, he is upright and he shuns evil. And here he is sitting in dust and ashes, covered with boils, unrecognizable to his friends, just like Jesus. Job was upright, yet he was covered with sin, right? He was covered with boils, which is a picture of the sufferings of sin, just like Jesus was. It also reminds me a little bit of Joseph, right? Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew not him. Remember, the brothers did not recognize Joseph, not because he was beaten and marred, but because he looked like an Egyptian. He looked like a Gentile, right? Which is one of the reasons Israel doesn't recognize Jesus today, because Jesus looks like a Gentile. He looks like the God of the Gentiles. But the brothers did not recognize Joseph in the same way that Job's friends did not recognize him. So he is upright, yet he is covered with boils, depression, tragedy, sadness. What his friends will imply is the result of his sin. So they're going to falsely accuse him of suffering because of his sin, just like Jesus was falsely accused in many ways. So we're going to examine the diagnoses of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. But before we do, what do you think? Okay? Why is it that people in this world suffer? There's a lot of reasons. We have biblical answers and we have our own opinions. But why is it that people today suffer?
Because Satan still has control of the world.
Good answer. His old tactics are his same tactics that he uses today. And the way that he attacked Job, he attacks us today as well.
Not very imaginative.
Right. And I was listening to, I can't even remember who it was, commenting about history repeating itself. Why is it that history repeats itself? Even secular people will say history repeats itself. It's because the enemy never changes. The enemy is the same enemy that was the enemy in the beginning. He's using the same tactics over and over and over, and if we don't become wise to that, we will repeat the same mistakes.
And we have our same weaknesses.
Same weaknesses, absolutely. Same temptations. Now, let me ask you this. Job is going to make the case that he is suffering even though he has not sinned in such a way to deserve this degree of suffering. However, have you ever sinned and suffered because of it?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. We often suffer the consequences of our own sin. So there's still that argument. We've all gotten into trouble. We've been weak to temptation, and we have suffered because we have sinned. And that is still a truth today. When you sin, you suffer. However, there's another reason for suffering that Job's going to try and understand that is distinct from the consequences of your own choices. And that's kind of what the argument between him and his friends is going to look like. So Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad are all going to have a say after the 7 days of silence, and Job's going to respond to each one of them. There's 3 sets of conversation. First of all, Eliphaz speaks and then Job speaks. Then Bildad speaks and Job responds, and Zophar speaks and Job responds. So that happens 3 times in a row, right? So there's a lot of dialogue. Except on the last one, the first 2 guys get to speak and Job responds, but then instead of Zophar speaking on this 3rd round, Elihu comes in and makes his speech. And that's the one that we're going to set apart for another lesson. So one thing that I would recommend, I hope that you've read the entire book of Job. I know some of you have done your homework. Go back and read it again and simply look at isolating Eliphaz's arguments. Read what he has to say in isolation. Then look at the Bildad's arguments in isolation. And then look at Zophar's arguments, because then you can sort of start to formulate their position and what they are accusing Job of. So we're going to begin with Eliphaz. Eliphaz basically speaks from a position of experience. He draws his wisdom based on what he has experienced, what he has seen, and what he has heard, and what he has witnessed. So we're going to call him Eliphaz the Experienced. His discourses are found in chapters 4 and 5, 15, and 22. So again, if you want to go read just what he has to say in isolation, you kind of get to know his personality. Now, what I've attempted to do is just lift a few quotes from his discourse to try and establish what his position is, okay? But there's a whole lot of words in the middle of the book of Job, so this is just sort of scratching the surface. But he begins in Job chapter 4. Listen to his opening statement. Surely you have instructed many and have strengthened their feeble hands. Your words, he's speaking to Job, have steadied those who stumbled, and you have stabilized the knees that were buckling. So he starts out and commends Job for past good behavior, for past righteousness, for acting uprightly. Remember that, okay? As far as the words that come out of the mouths of these men, that's the only comforting thing that I can find. The first few words of Eliphaz. Again, their silence in showing their empathy with Job was probably comforting to Job. And then this couple of lines from Eliphaz, he's saying, yeah, you've seen a few good things, and he commends Job for that. There are a couple of places later in the chapter where you can derive some comfort from the words of his friends, but they also come with the sting. They talk about God's mercy, about his restoration, but the friends basically say, if you want to be restored, if you want to have that hope, you have to repent of your sin. So they're always accusing him of some sort of specific sin, some sort of secret sin that they don't know what it is, but is worthy of his affliction. So even when they're comforting him, saying God will restore you, it's going to be okay, if you repent of that sin that you've committed that we don't know what it is, okay? So it always comes with a little bit of a sting. They're telling him he has to turn from his evil ways in order to receive that forgiveness, that mercy, and that restoration. So even in the moments of hope expressed by the 3, always a little bit of a jab. So again, there's not a lot of comfort from these three friends except for this. Now remember, Eliphaz did start out and commend him for some good works, because he's going to change his mind here pretty quickly. Now, Job chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, Eliphaz says, "Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen," oh, and by the way, that's a total typo. Let me read it out of the Bible. Y'all just put an X through that because I messed up. Verses 7 through 8. "Remember, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? Even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his nostrils they are consumed." So he starts out and says, yeah, you've done a few good things. Let me commend you for that. And then just a few verses later, he's saying, if you sow iniquity, you're going to reap iniquity, right? You reap what you sow is basically what he's telling him. So just a few lines later, he's saying, whoever perished being innocent. So he's implying here, Job is suffering. He's on his way to perishing. He's really just a few steps away from death, and he's longing for his own death. And Eliphaz is saying, why would this be the case? Why would you be perishing if you were innocent? Do you see how quickly he sort of changes his mind? He's trying to understand from his human perspective why Job is suffering, and he concludes it cannot be that he is innocent and suffering this affliction. Again, all three friends do not have the insight that we do of the heavenly realm where God himself said Job is upright and shuns evil. Have you considered my servant Job, right? They don't have that insight. Eliphaz's position is his experience. Notice the underlined phrase there, according to what I have seen, right? Those that sow wickedness reap the same. So he's saying, Job, you must have sown wickedness in order to be reaping this affliction. Later on, verses 12 through 19, Eliphaz talks about this strange experience that he has. Remember, his position is what he's seen, what he's witnessed, what he can observe. He's very scientific, what he has observed, right? But this is a strange experience. It says, now a thing was secretly brought to me, and mine ear received a little thereof. And thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falleth on men, fear came upon me, and trembling which made all my bones to shake. So he has this vision or this dream, right? This experience. Then a spirit passed before my face. The hair of my flesh stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern the form thereof. An image was before mine eyes. There was silence, and I heard a voice saying, shall mortal man be more just than God? Shall a man be more pure than his Maker? Behold, he put no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. How much less in them that dwell in the houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, which are crushed before the moth. So Eliphaz has this dream. I wonder if it was during the 7 days of silence, right? Maybe when he was sleeping, he had this dream in horror of observing what Job was going through. And this spirit reveals to Eliphaz, can a mortal be more just than God? Shall a man be more pure than his Maker? And of course the answer is no, right? One of the hard things about Job is every single argument from all three friends have some sort of seed of truth in it. Some of the things they say, you're going to go, yeah, I get that. That's right. That makes sense. Because the answer to this question, no, a man cannot be more just than God. A man cannot be justified by his own righteousness before God. But this is Eliphaz's experience. Now, Job chapter 5, verse 17, Eliphaz says to Job, behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty. So what is it that Eliphaz is implying to Job here?
It's good that you're being punished because you did something.
Yes, exactly. You're being punished, right? You're being chastened by the Almighty himself. But yes, it's good because you have a chance for repentance and a chance for restoration. But still, it is accusatory in its tone. Now, if you go through and read chapter 5, okay, and you glean what is said there, Eliphaz, and we're not going to do it, but Eliphaz lists specific things that wicked men suffer. Things like losing property, your seed being cut off, your children, your family being cut off, the terror of the people around you. All three men are going to do this. They're going to go through and say, here's a wicked person, here's a hypocrite, here's a person full of iniquity. This is what they experience. And all three of them are going to list what Job has experienced. Do you remember what it is that he's lost? What did we talk about last week? What is it that Job has recently suffered?
His family, his crops, his animals, his servants.
You got it. Family, animals, crops, servants. Some of that was taken by a natural disaster, and wind and all of that. Some of that was taken by attacking raiders, the Sabians and the Chaldeans, right? The warriors that came in and attacked him. So all three friends, at some point in their discourse, are going to start listing things. They're not going to say, Job, you, this happened to you. They're going to say, if you're wicked, then your family's going to be cut off. If you're wicked, you're going to suffer the terror of evil men. If you're wicked, there's not going to be enough food for your household because he's lost all of his crops, right? And so he delineates these things. At first, he's a little bit courteous and polite, but he becomes more direct and accusatory, and all three of them do as the book progresses. So happy is the man whom God correcteth. So he's saying Job's being corrected. Job chapter 15. What is man that he should be pure, or one born of woman that he should be righteous? If God puts no trust in his holy ones, that is his angels, if even the heavens are not pure in his eyes, how much less a man who is vile and corrupt and who drinks injustice like water? The interesting thing about these accusations is I wonder if those three friends could stand up under their opinions, right? What about Eliphaz? Is he just before God? Is he more pure than his maker? Not in any measure. Job 15, 17 to 20. Listen to me and I will inform you. I will describe what I have seen. Do you see how he's observing the world and that's his source of wisdom, right? What was declared by wise men and what was not concealed from their fathers, to whom alone the land was given when no foreigner passed among them. A wicked man writhes in pain all his days, and only a few years are reserved for the ruthless. So this is in another of his discourses. Job is before him, covered in boils and ashes, and Eliphaz is saying, a wicked man writhes in pain, right? Can you imagine Job like scraping his boils, and Eliphaz is over there saying, a wicked man writhes in pain. Job can't get comfortable. He can't sleep. When it's daytime, he longs for the night. When the night becomes long, he longs for the day. There's never any comfort for him. He is writhing in pain. And this is Eliphaz's wisdom by his observation. So Eliphaz may be right to some degree, but it is not helpful to Job at all. He's the one writhing in pain. So the implication there is that Job is wicked, and he says few years are reserved for the ruthless. So what's he saying there? Job,
You're going to die.
you're going to die, and it's all your fault, right? Now
I
again,
know what you did, but you really messed up.
something good. You better repent. On the next page, Job 22. This is Eliphaz's last discourse. Remember, he has 3 speeches. On this last one, look how direct he becomes. Is not thy wickedness great, and thine iniquities infinite? Can you believe that? That's unbelievable.
No evidence.
Well, listen to what he says. For thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught, and stripped the naked of their clothing. Thou hast not given water to the weary to drink, and thou hast withholden bread from the hungry. But as for the mighty man, he had the earth, and the honorable man dwelt in it. Thou hast sent widows away empty, and the arms of the fatherless have been broken. Therefore snares are round about thee, and sudden fear troubleth thee, or darkness that thou canst not see, and an abundance of waters covers thee. This is the same guy that started out and said, here's a few good things that you've done, right? And now he's directly accusing him. He's like, you don't feed the hungry. You're rich and prosperous, but you don't feed the hungry. You don't help the widows. You have, sorry, my phone's up here doing some weird things. Amber Alert. Okay. So he's directly accusing him, and he's saying, your wickedness is great, your iniquity is infinite, and then he lists things. I don't think he really knows those things. I think he's accusing him, saying maybe he'll, own up to this. Maybe he'll confess this. And he lists these things. Job later on is going to respond. Let me give you a taste of Job's response later on. Job from his own mouth says, because I delivered the poor that cried, and the fatherless, and him that had none to help. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My judgment was a robe and a diadem. I was eyes to the blind, I was feet to the lame, I was father to the poor, and the cause which I knew not I searched out. I brake the jaws of the wicked and plucked the spoil out of his teeth. So Job says, I helped the poor, I helped the widows, I did all of those things that I thought I was supposed to do, yet I am still suffering. So Eliphaz's accusations fall flat, right? Job 22 verses 21 to 26. I'm just going to read the bold print there. If thou return to the Almighty, thou shalt be built up, thou shalt put away iniquity from thy tabernacles. Then shalt thou lay up gold as dust, and the gold of Ophir as stones of the brooks. The Almighty shall be thy defense. So he's saying, you've done all these poor things, but here's the hope. If you turn from those wicked things that you've done, then there is restoration. And what does he say? Your gold's going to be laid up as dust. You're going to prosper, right? Have you ever heard that in these days? If you do the right thing, you'll get that car that you want, right?
Yeah.
Or the jet, or the promotion, or your health will be restored. We hear that preached today. So these ideas are not new, right? They're old. This is coming way back from Job, one of the oldest books in the world. So if we had to summarize Eliphaz's position, first of all, he's speaking from his observations, what he's experienced and seen, and his implication is that suffering is always the direct outcome of sin. So Job is suffering because he has sinned, right?
That was the common thinking back then.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I would say it's the common thinking today as well. And I am even guilty of that thinking, right? Have you ever suffered something even though you don't have a specific sin and you think, well, God must be unhappy with me, right? I'm experiencing trouble because God is unhappy with me. God was not unhappy with Job. Now, Job's going to stumble. He's going to get a little bit arrogant as he talks with his friends, and we'll address that. And God's going to put Job in his place. But in the beginning, God said that Job is upright and he shuns evil, right? So his friends look at him, and Eliphaz says, I know your problem. You're a sinner. And I have done that very thing. I've looked at someone. I know what their problem is. They need to do this, this, and this, and if only, and they shoulda, and right? Or even looking at natural disasters. I'm just going to confess. Have you ever looked at a natural disaster and said, that city must be sinful? It's like Sodom and Gomorrah, right?
That just goes to show that we don't understand the heavenly realm.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's something else going on.
There it
We
is.
can't- We're in the dark.
Yes, right. To some degree, right? Now, and Job and his three friends, they don't have the revelation of Jesus at this point, and the suffering that he was willing to take on himself, right, in our place. And we have that revelation, but they didn't know that. And so this is the tradition of old. This is the human way of thinking about things, right? You are not prosperous because you have sinned. You don't deserve it, something like that. And when you are in affliction, it's because you deserve it, right? And we could all argue we die because of our sin, right? That comes from Genesis, so we are responsible for our sin, but we know that we have a God that justifies us. So that's Eliphaz. Eliphaz is the oldest one, so he gets to speak first in all of the cases, and Job responds to him every time. The next friend that talks is Bildad. His position comes from tradition. He says, this is what's always been done, and so since it's been successful in the past, then this is probably the way it is. If I had to identify with any of the friends, I would probably identify with Bildad. I'm sort of a tradition type person. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? That can kind of be a hindrance in your career, though, I'm finding out, because then you're not innovative, right? And you don't want to try new things and change and all that good stuff. But Bildad speaks from tradition. Now think about Jesus and what he faced. When he was dueling with the Pharisees, he was dueling with the traditions of men, right? The legalism that was passed down from ages through the oral law. Jesus had to battle against that. So Bildad, the second friend, is the traditionalist. Here's how he begins. He's not as courteous as Eliphaz the elder. He starts his speech with this, Job 8:6. If thou wert pure and upright, surely now he would awake for thee and make the habitation of thy righteousness prosperous. So Bildad says, if you were pure and upright, then God would make you prosperous. Right? Do you hear that common theme with Eliphaz? If you would repent, God would restore you. If you were pure and upright, God would make you prosperous. Job 8, verses 8 through 10. Here's Bildad's position. For I inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to search of the fathers. For we are of but yesterday. He's saying we're not very old. Our wisdom, Eliphaz is talking about his experience and his observation, but he's not that old compared to the wisdom that we have passed down from generations and from our fathers, right? Because our days upon the earth are as a shadow. Shall not they teach thee and tell thee and utter the words out of their heart? So instead of going from experience, observation, and witness, Bildad says, what is the tradition? What's the wisdom of the fathers? Look at Job 8:13. So are the paths of all that forget God, and the hypocrite's hope shall perish. At this point, Job is sitting in ashes. He's suffering the accusations of his friends. He wants to die. He wishes he was never born. Does he have much hope right now? No. And what does Bildad say? The hypocrite's hope shall perish. So Job maintains his innocence before Eliphaz. Bildad has witnessed all of this, and Bildad says the hypocrite is the one whose hope will perish. Well, Job's hope is perishing, therefore he must be a hypocrite, right? Saying that he is upright and then having some sort of secret sin to contradict himself. Job 8:20. Behold, God will not cast away a perfect man, neither will he help the evildoers. Job has been cast away, in their opinion, right? His prosperity, his family, all the comforts. Don't forget his wife. Remember? Curse God and die is what she says. She gives him Satan's message. So he has lost all of that. He's been cast away. He no longer has his health, his reputation, or his appearance. And Bildad says, well, God wouldn't do that to a perfect man, right? So their speeches, again, they each have some degree of truth, yet they are sort of passive-aggressive in stating things that imply the guilt of Job. In Job 18, Bildad's second speech, he does the same thing that Eliphaz does. He goes through a list, and you should read it, and pick out specifics. You're going to lose your property, you're going to lose your hope, you're going to lose your peace, you're going to lose your family, you're going to have wicked men around you, you're going to suffer terrors. So he lists all the things that a hypocrite would suffer, and these are all the things that Job has suffered, therefore Job is the hypocrite, right? So Eliphaz says, this is what wicked men suffer. Bildad now says, this is what hypocrites suffer. So in maintaining his innocence, that he's not a sinner, Bildad now implies that he's a hypocrite. Job 25, verses 4 through 6. How then can man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that is born of a woman? Behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not. Yea, the stars are not pure in his sight. Remember, stars are kind of a code word for angels. How much less man that is a worm, and the son of man, which is a worm. This is an amazing verse as well. And see, Dawn knows where I'm going, right? The son of man, which is a worm. You know anything about that? You know anything about worms? Anything about a tola worm? Everybody go like this. The tola worm, remember?
Is that the one that ate the vine?
That's the one that ate the vine. In Jonah, right? The worm that affixes itself to the tree and dies on the tree and produces that red dye that stains the tree, and the babies within the mother's body consume the mother's body so that they can have life, right? This is the worm. It's called the tola worm in Hebrew that ate Jonah's vine. This is the same worm from Psalm 22, which record the words of Christ that say, I am a worm and not a man. I am a tola and not a man. So we know that tola worm is a picture of Christ. It's a type or a shadow of Christ. That's the worm that Bildad refers to right here. And he says, the Son of Man, which is a worm. Okay, the first worm is a different kind of worm, but the second time he says the word in verse 6, it's the tola, right? How can man be justified with God? First of all, they can't by their own righteousness. It is impossible because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But we are justified by the righteousness of Christ, the one who is the fulfillment or the substance of the shadow of that tola worm. So here the tola worm shows up again. I didn't know it was here, so it was exciting to stumble across it again. If you're interested in that, if you weren't here the day that we covered the red heifer, there's a video on our YouTube channel, the red heifer. I spoke about the tola worm in that video, so if you want to go watch that, it's really interesting. So Bildad is calling Job a worm, right? Which is interesting because that is what David recorded about the words of Christ in Psalm 22. Remember, Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? They have pierced my hands and my the bulls of Bashan surround me. They have cast lots for my clothing, or something to that effect. And I am a worm and not a man. So here is that reference to the tola worm. So Bildad, the traditionalist, says it's always been like this. The innocent do not suffer like you do, Job. You need to repent. So if we summarize Bildad, the consensus of what he says, seeing that trouble has come to Job, he must be sinful. Therefore, Job is a hypocrite, right? Eliphaz, his position was by experience, the innocent are not afflicted like this, right? Only the wicked suffer. Bildad says, since we can see all this trouble around you, Job, the evidence speaks for itself, you must be a hypocrite. The last friend is Zophar. He speaks a lot shorter than the other two friends, and he is more rash. There is no courtesy. He is very direct and accusatory, and very brash and brazen in the way that he speaks to Job. Zophar must be the youngest of the three. His speeches are recorded in chapters 11 and 20, and his position is simply that he's the judge. Here's the conclusion of the matter, right? Job 11, verses 3 through 6, Zophar says, should thy lies make men hold their peace? And when thou mockest, shall no man make thee ashamed? So this is Zophar's first speech, and he's been listening to the dialogue between the other two friends and Job, and this is how he opens. You're a liar and a mocker, right? In the King James language. For thou hast said, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in thine eyes, but oh, that God would speak and open his lips against thee, and that he would show thee the secrets of wisdom, that they are double to that which is. So Zophar is saying, there's a whole lot of wisdom of God, Job, that you don't know anything about. Now, Zophar's position is that he has the answer. I didn't underline it thou, but if you underline therefore, that's his position, right? Eliphaz says, I have seen, I have experienced. Bildad says, listen to the fathers of old. Zophar just says, know this, Job, right? He doesn't back it up with experience or with tradition or history. He just says, know thou. Know therefore that God exacteth of thee less than thine iniquity deserveth. Can you imagine? What's he saying there? Zophar.
You could have gotten worse.
Yeah.
You deserve worse.
You deserve worse. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say.
As much that Job has endured, he's endured everything except death. Wouldn't you say that? He's a few steps away from death. He says, I have come through by the skin of my teeth. So really all he has is his gums, right? He has suffered everything, and he is still suffering. And to make matters worse, it's lingering. It's not going away. There's no hope for it to get better. And Zophar says, God exacteth of thee less than thine iniquity deserveth. So Zophar says, know this, Job, you should be suffering more. You deserve more than this. God is being merciful to you and allowing you to suffer what you have. Okay? So just
Supposed to be his friend.
yes. These are his ministers. Right. And Zophar knows it all. He says God's wisdom is twice what you can imagine, but know this, Job, right? And you really deserve more than this. Job 20, verse 5, look how the phrase is begun. Knowest thou, right? Knowest now not this of old, since man was placed upon the earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite but for a moment. Was there a time in Job's life that he was joyful and prosperous? Yeah, absolutely. He's been on that side of things. Now he's suffering, and Zophar is saying, that joy that you had was only for a moment, because now you're getting what you deserve. Actually, you're getting less than what you deserve because you're a hypocrite, right? The triumphing, the prospering of the wicked is for a moment. So Zophar's position is that he's got it figured out, right? He's the youngest of the three, and he only gets 2 speeches anyway. They don't like listening to him. Elihu's going to come in and take his place. But his position is the wicked, if they prosper, is only for a short period of time. And in Job 20, by the way, you can go through and pick up the list that he gives are specific things that Job has suffered, and he's saying this is what wicked people suffer, implying again that Job is wicked. So Zophar's summary, Job is a sinner and he's getting less than he deserves. Okay? So how does Job feel at this point?
Worse,
He was
probably.
depressed before.
Who needs it?
Yes.
Friends like that.
Yeah, who is it?
So he's now dealing with psychology, he's dealing with emotional abuse, he's dealing with false accusations, to his face that they can't back up. And they've made a really good case against him. It's him against the three, right? And he's humble. I just think about the way he looks. His head is shaved, he's covered with boils, he is skin and bones, he's scraping his boils with a piece of pottery, and he's covered in ashes, and he's trying to defend himself. And all he's receiving is attacks from those who he would hope for comfort. And there's a point that he gets so disparate that he just sort of begs them for a little bit of comfort and relief, and they don't give it to him. So let's talk about kind of summarizing these three positions, and we'll go through this very quickly. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar do not have the insight that we do from the Word of God, where we have the picture of the heavenly realm, that Satan is responsible for these attacks on Job, and God permitted it to happen. They don't know any of that. They know their experience, they know tradition, and they think they know what they know, right? So Eliphaz says only the wicked suffer. Bildad, the wicked always suffer, and Zophar, the prosperity of the wicked is short-lived. Their view is that suffering is only caused by sin. There is no other reason for suffering. Because Job is suffering, he must have sinned. Okay? And we know Job sinned. He even stumbles in his arguments with his friends and becomes arrogant a little bit. And even bold against God and accusing God of being responsible for his suffering. Yet, Job's position is, look at my heart. I have lived in a way that pleases God. I've been upright and I've done all of those things. I have not willfully rebelled against God, right? So why am I suffering? Let's talk about the prosperity gospel. That's popular these days. And we can even hear it from the book of Job. The prosperity gospel goes something like this. Calamity is the direct outcome of sin. Divine favor or disfavor is indicated by a man's material prosperity and health versus poverty and adversity, right? That a righteous person prospers and an unrighteous person suffers affliction. That's essentially the prosperity gospel. And goodness or wickedness are always rewarded in this life. That's kind of a few of the tenets of the prosperity gospel. And in some cases, that's how it turns out. But the counterexample for that is Jesus. He was absolutely perfect, righteous, pure, holy. He never sinned. And he suffered the worst adversity, temptation, suffering, torture than any man has ever suffered. He carried the weight of sin of the whole world on himself, and he was perfect, right? So there's problems with that prosperity gospel. Now, I told y'all tomorrow I have a new class, or I'm starting a new class on campus. It's contemporary math, and in that class we learn logic. It's a real simple class, but we get to study logic. Has anyone in here ever studied logic, like truth tables, reasoning, little bit?
Yeah, with electronics.
Yes, exactly. Electronics has the same type of, probably different notation, but the same as logic and reasoning. Lawyers a lot of times have to take logic. Mathematicians have to have a lot of logic because we write theorems and corollaries, and mathematics starts with a foundation and then builds on that foundation, so you have to have good reasoning along the way so that you end up with theorems that are accurate and deductive and all that good stuff. So there are certain types of arguments called syllogisms. Have you ever heard of that? It goes all the way back to the Greeks, but it's very simple arguments based on a couple of premises or hypotheses followed by a conclusion. Whenever you know what this is, you'll hear people talk in syllogisms all the time. But to summarize, Eliphaz, his position, if Job were not sinful, this trouble would not have come, right? Bildad, Job must be sinful, seeing the trouble has indeed come. And so far, Job is sinful and deserves his affliction. In fact, he deserves more than his affliction. If we put that into a little 3-line argument, that's what's called a syllogism. I'm thinking about using this in my contemporary math class as a good example. Here's what it would sound like. Hypothesis number 1. If Job were not sinful, he would not deserve affliction. Hypothesis number 2. Job is afflicted, right? They've got a lot of evidence. They can observe this with their eyes. Job is clearly afflicted. The conclusion is statement number 3. Therefore, Job is sinful. This is the summary of the arguments of the 3 friends in a little 3-line argument. If Randall were here, I would do a truth table and prove it, and you'd be like, oh yeah, it's a good argument, right? This is called contrapositive reasoning. Does that ring a bell, Ron, at all? You ever? So this is a good argument. That means it is sound reasoning. You can read it and it sounds logical. However, this happens sometimes. It's good reasoning, but the conclusion is not true, right? Now, Job is sinful, but he is not a willful rebel against God. And it does not appear that his past sins merit this degree of suffering, okay? So there must be a flaw in the premises or the hypotheses. By Job's experience, he is not sinful, yet he is experiencing the affliction. There must be another reason for his suffering. So I was thinking about this on the way to church today, and I could say it like this. If you are not late, you do not have children. You are late, therefore you have children. Okay? But I discovered this morning my children are not with me, but I'm still late. There must be another cause of my lateness. Could it be yours truly? Right? Now, I'm not late. I am precisely punctual. That means I have no margin, and if anything happens, I will be late, but otherwise I'm going to be there by the skin of my teeth, okay? And this is Job's argument. He's saying, okay, I follow your reasoning. However, the problem is I am not sinful, yet I am still suffering, right? That's called a counterexample. His life debunks their argument, right? He's saying, I am not sinful and I'm suffering. What's the cause? His friends do not help him to answer his question. Job is the counterexample. If God always punishes the wicked and rewards the just, then why does it appear that to Job that some of the wicked escape suffering and prosper until death? And that comes out in his arguments. In Job's experience, the upright suffer as well, though he does not know why. That's the question that his friends are not helping him with, right? Because they will not hear his expression of his innocence, that he has not sinned in a way to merit this suffering. Because his friends think they know it all, they have the truth, they don't seek any other answer. They're not hearing what he has to say. They believe him to be a wicked, secret, sinning hypocrite who's getting what he deserves. Their assumption that suffering is the result of wickedness is supported by the apparent evidence of his affliction. So they're not going to hear what he has to say. They think that suffering is always the result of sin. They can observe the evidence of his suffering, therefore he must be a sinner. They cannot hear or receive into their person his claim that he is innocent. So they cannot possibly answer his question because they don't believe him. All they can do is accuse him. They think they have the answer, so they seek no other answer. In the meantime, the answer that Job is seeking is still left unanswered. His friends can't help him because they can't hear what he's saying. He's saying, I'm innocent, yet I'm suffering. Why? Right? There's no answer that they can help him with. Job is the counterexample. That means he's debunking their argument by his very life. He is upright, yet he is suffering. He proves their argument defective. The accepted truth that only the wicked suffer and that they always suffer cannot be reconciled with Job's experience. So the arguments end in deadlock. There is no accommodation of Job's condition into their reasoning on the part of his friends. So Job still has no answer for his suffering. So he's lost his possessions, his prosperity, his means of generating prosperity, his family, his health. His wife can't stand him. He has lost his reputation. He has now suffered the accusations of his friends and their emotional abuse. And to top it all off, he still has an unanswered question. Right?
They lost 3 more friends.
There you go. There you go.
No, we needed the example of Job, for modern day because, of exactly his scenario that, sometimes bad things happen to good people.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to break that, that it's all related to sin.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it helps me too because I've had the attitude of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar at some point, right? That you know what's wrong, and here's why, and this is what you need to do, and here's your problem, and I know it all, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it also helps us to stop and think, wait a second, maybe there is an explanation that we can't see, and
Well, it teaches us that sin may not be the reason why you're suffering.
right.
Well, sometimes it's like I've said last week, sometimes we go through things to help somebody else go through the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily because we sinned, but because God knows that we would be able to reach that person that needs to know what to do next.
Yes.
I think it also has to be said that, God said, judge not lest you be judged.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a big lesson in don't be judgmental to other people.
For sure.
You don't know what's going on in their lives. You haven't walked in their shoes.
And again, in all 3 friends, there is some aspect of truth, and sometimes, yep, you're suffering because you made all these mistakes and these bad choices and these decisions, and these are the consequences of your decisions, right? That's still true, yet there is a cause for suffering that is distinct from sin. And that's what Job is trying to find the source of, right? Why am I suffering if I don't have sin?
Well, and I think when we make a bad choice and suffer because of it, we know why.
Right. Right.
Our conscience always tells us, you did this, and this is the results of it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that conscience is the Holy Spirit or,
Mm-hmm.
just our own sense of what's good and right, or
Mm-hmm.
good and evil, whatever. But anyway, Job didn't have that consciousness that, oh, I sinned.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I did something wrong, so this is the result of it. He didn't have that.
Yeah.
But part of this too is we're talking about Job, the person that remains here, to have to bear the burden of all these bad things that have happened. But what about his family that died, whatever?
Right.
Do you consider them that they were sinful, therefore they died? They whatever.
Yes, and I think Eliphaz addresses, I think it was Eliphaz, he basically says that the reason his kids died is because they were also sinful. So he's saying, you're a bad father, you raised your children to be sinners, they died out of divine judgment as well, which is painful, right? Because, he's now bearing the accusation that his children were also sinful and they got what they deserved. So that is addressed and I think it was Eliphaz, but I could be wrong about that. So.
Judgment and vengeance belong to the Lord. And these, you asked, I don't remember when it was, you asked for a definition of love one time. Love is the giving of yourself for others. I mean, totally. and they're not practicing love. They're trying to play God,
Mhm.
and you don't do that. You're not the judge. He's the judge.
Mhm.
And they should have, they started out really good, staying with him, staying there with him,
Mhm.
and weeping, and sharing his burden, and
Mhm.
they totally did a 360.
Mhm.
They totally turned around and went against him, and that's not love.
Yeah.
They should have loved him no matter what, like Jesus did.
And they're also coming at him from a position of comfort. They get to leave. This gets to end. They get to go home. And their wife is there, their kids, their home, their oxen and donkeys, right? They get to go back to that comfort. And so they're kind of looking down on him from a position of strength. And in Job's defense, it does look like he's guilty, right? He's lost everything. He's suffering all the things that the wicked suffer that they're saying. So the evidence sort of seems to be stacked against him, and no one will hear his plea of I haven't done anything to deserve this. They're not hearing him. And so the evidence is sort of against him from their position and what they can observe. But of course they can't see the whole picture. So.
Did you really go there to sympathize with him, or did they go there to judge him?
Good question.
They may have been jealous of his prosperity before he,
Oh,
and this is the time they kind of.
you might be right. How you spell that? And if their words, if they were in his position, would they be able to stand up under their own? I mean, they've got a magnifying glass on him. So.
Instead of pointing the finger, there's 3 fingers pointing at yourself.
That's true. That's true. Okay, great discussion. Thanks for your input. Next week, we will talk about Elihu and Job, or there will be a